Let's see, so this is Psychosis, Citizenship, and Recovery, Mapping a Life's Journey. And this is a work in progress. The abstracts are submitted a long time ago, and I thought, oh, I'll have time to do some research, this and that, but life happens. And so this, I think there is good information in it, but I will not have a finished journey map, which I had hoped to show you this today. You know what, I'm going to use the mouse because it will be easier. So this is a lot of photographs of my family. My parents, me in Hong Kong. I was born in Hong Kong in 1951. This is me, my mother, and middle sister on board. Oh, no, that's okay. That's okay, thank you. That's aboard the USS President Cleveland, which sailed from Hong Kong to San Francisco in August and September of 1955. Me aboard the USS President Cleveland. The three sisters in 1987, the year after my son was born. My green card, my naturalization certificate, you know about the passport photograph. Me and my husband, my son's father, me and my son, my husband, me and my son at his college graduation. Welcome. So this is Mapping a Life Story. Did I skip? No, sorry. Mapping a Life's Journey, the backstory of our lives. And so the theme, as you all know, is citizenship. And it has come out of the work of Dr. Michael Rowe, who is a professor at the Yale Program for Recovery and Community Health. And this is a figure that appears in his book on citizenship, which is a 2015 publication. And those of you who attended the plenary session yesterday morning know that the work he has done grew out of the work that he did as part of the ACT team working with homeless people who suffer from significant mental health challenges. And basically in his pre-model, life begins with non-citizenship, and he was working with adults. So there's, the outreach team reached out to homeless people on the green, and homeless people are not citizens because they generally don't have rights, resources. Their roles are often, compromised. Relationships certainly are, and responsibilities frequently are few. And then as they work within the system with people who are doing the work of recovery, then they begin, working with integrated mental health systems of care, and they have bounded citizenship, are beginning to do the work that's needed to reintegrate into the community. But they still have lack of access to mainstream opportunities, system-dependent, substandard housing. And then they, through the work of the Citizenship Project and the various groups that were described so beautifully yesterday, they begin living in the community and living full lives and working and having friends and doing all of the things that much of the rest of the world does and is able to do. And that is considered full citizenship with rights, responsibilities, roles, resources, and relationship. But when I looked at that, I thought, I think that citizenship is a perfect model for viewing psychosis and understanding the conditions of our lives that allow us to live fully, to hold ourselves erect in the world, and to have friends, to have responsibilities, and all of those things that everyone in the world wants. So psychosis is one way in which the mind and spirit respond to feelings of powerlessness, danger, and fear. And these feelings are often born of trauma, abuse, discrimination, alienation, and isolation. When disbelieved and then fed by shame and guilt, they can grow to destructive proportions. So something happened before people were non-citizens. They didn't emerge as adults, as not citizens. So pre-trauma and pre-history, psychiatric history, Citizenship within society as part of family is understood. Citizenship within family is understood, and often in cases of abuse at the hands of family members, the parents have abrogated their responsibility to their children to love and protect them, and the children have been denied their rights to be loved and nurtured by their parents. And assumption with a full citizenship within society upon reaching maturity is expected. So many of you are familiar with the ACE pyramid, adverse childhood experiences. And basically all of the, the various conditions that people who struggle with mental health face results in early death. And the three bottom layers of the ACE pyramid are generational embodiment and historical trauma. And does this work? Because I don't like the boom. Can you hear? Is the microphone working? Okay. Social conditions and local context and adverse childhood experiences. Yesterday we talked a lot about the bottom two steps or layers of the pyramid, and adverse childhood experiences, as I expect all of you know, trauma and abuse in early childhood is a significant trigger or activator for hearing voices. And then we look at the pair of ACEs, which include maternal depression, which my mother suffered from, physical and emotional neglect. That was emotional neglect was one of my traumas. Emotional and sexual abuse, not my issue. Divorce later in life, my son struggled with that. Mental illness, so all of those things. And again, within inner city communities and many of the clients of the agencies at which many of us work have to deal with that. Generational poverty, discrimination, racism, all lead to that. So some common triggers for psychosis. I'm going to try to go very quickly, like finish up in 15 or 20 minutes and then leave time for Q&A. Does this go till 4:45? Is that right? Okay, thank you. So trauma. And trauma doesn't have to be severe physical or psychological abuse. It can be maternal distress during gestation. When I was, in 1951, my mother returned to China with me in utero to say goodbye to her parents, and then returned to Hong Kong where my family had fled in 1949, just weeks prior to Mao's troops marching into the city. Immigration, especially before age 4 and during adolescence. I was 3.5 when we came to the United States. Emotional neglect. I had my own ama in Hong Kong because my mother was a career woman. And so I said goodbye to her somewhere in Hong Kong and never saw her again. So in the early weeks of my mother dropping me off at nursery school so she could go to work, I would, fall to the floor and wrap my arms around her knees and beg her not to go because I was afraid I would never see her again. But when she kept coming back, that behavior stopped. Bereavement or loss, move to a new community, social isolation, foreign travel, not living up to own expectations or expectations of those close to you. And I have too many asides, but foreign travel, I was floridly psychotic for 3 of the 4 weeks my husband and I spent in Europe in 1985. And curiously, the whole issue of safety as being protective and something that relieves people of the distresses that can cause psychosis. The moment we set foot on American soil, meaning the moment I passed cleared customs, my voices stopped. It was truly bizarre and I don't understand it, but it did happen. A new job, racism, matters of the spirit, spiritual experiences, abuse, bullying, going off to college, lack of sleep. Sleep is hugely important. I become much more symptomatic when I'm too busy and I'm not sleeping well. I now resort to taking a mild sleep aid which I took last night, if I have to perform the next day. Work on an intensive isolating project like writing a book or dissertation. A sense of powerlessness, powerlessness against our voices, powerlessness within our environment, with siblings, with classmates, with whomever. Fear, shame, and guilt, and more about that later. Self-doubt, hugely important. Inability to find affirmation and support. When our reality is denied, it becomes so difficult. And we know what's real, we know what we experience. And when people say, oh, no, that didn't happen. No, it's not important. It is, yes, thank you. Isolation, ignoring the voices for too long. One of the common phrases in the Hearing Voices movement is that the voices are real, and they are real in the sense that they often belong to real, living, breathing people in our lives, and they certainly refer to real things that we're struggling with. They don't always speak directly, but they are a sign that we need to pay attention to the way in which we're living our lives. Ignoring the voices for too long, and gaining power over your voices or shifting the power balance. And when I was going through my second extended psychotic break from consensual reality, unlike the reigning wisdom, as spoken by Eleanor Longden, to treat our most negative voices, most difficult voices, with the utmost compassion and respect. I yelled back at my voices, which was not a good idea, because when you yell at people, it doesn't work very well. And my voices didn't like it much either. But I was shifting the power balance. I was standing up to them, but I was subject to so much more harassment and some physical sensations because of my voices. So the backstories of our lives. Sorry, I'll try this because it won't be so annoying. So this is a work in progress, and what I'm going to do is go through these, sort of some of the high and low points of my life, and I do have handouts which you all can take with you. I don't know, do I need to distribute them now? Because, thank you. So, the backstories of my life, the various traumas I experienced, and both Françoise Davoine and Jim Gorley, who were longtime beloved members of this organization, both encouraged me to explore familial trauma. And so my parents were married in 1937, and that was a very troubled time in China. The Japanese occupation occurred shortly thereafter. They fled to Hong Kong, where my eldest sister Elaine was born, and then they fled. The communists went from place to place within China ahead of the communists, and ultimately fled from Shanghai to Hong Kong weeks before Mao's troops marched into the city. So I will send you the PowerPoint. I want to get through this talk and the experiences and just leave things open for Q&A. But I think for them, the understanding, they had a stoic response, and we're grateful for their lives and continuing livelihood. Maternal distress during gestation. My mother, I imagined that I was, when my mother returned to China, she must have been inordinately distressed, and I imagined that I was bathed in some toxic chemical wash. That's just my imagination. But research has indicated that it is a known cause, potential cause for psychosis. And then some of the, mostly positive things that happened to me. The Pacific crossing from Hong Kong to San Francisco, the transcontinental journey by train across the United States from Los Angeles to Indianapolis and then continuing on to Bloomington, Indiana. And my family was able to come to the United States thanks to the Aid Refugee Chinese Intellectuals Program, which had been established in 1952 by the Eisenhower administration to prevent brain drain from communist China to the Soviet Union. And under the auspices of the act, any American-trained Chinese was able to come to this country without having to place their names on the immigration list. So we were languishing at the bottom of the list and were able to come to this country. And I felt that there were some mild traumas, but mostly the experience was positive, and perhaps the most positive thing about it were the stories my father told later throughout my life of, my telling people on the train, when they asked, "Where are you from?" I would say, "I live in Indiana, California." And I loved learning the language of our new homeland. And I loved particularly the word transcontinental. And I would say it at every possible opportunity. And just the pride in me and the love that my father manifested was hugely, hugely important and has fostered, is one of the foundations on which I built my recovery and which has fostered my resilience. So I told you about falling to the floor and wrapping my arms around my mother's knees. And another thing that happened is that I must have been so distressed about my ama that I would fall often in the early years. I would just trip and fall, and I'm really clumsy. And for some reason, I would never put my arms out to break the fall. So I would always hit my forehead. And I now have 2 permanent goose eggs on both sides of my forehead because I fell so often that, there was some damage to the bone. And I spoke to, maternal depression. So father had his career. We got to the States when Uncle Jerry Schmidt, who was one of his best friends at Brown, offered him a postdoc when someone chose to go elsewhere. And so we lived in Bloomington, Indiana. Mother worked in the Indiana University Library in some probably minor capacity. We then moved to Youngstown, Ohio, for her father had gotten an associate professorship. And then mother was pretty unhappy there. There were some she mentored someone who then competed with her and got a promotion, and there were some other issues. So mother had lost a family, homeland, and heritage, and also never again found as much professional satisfaction as she had in Hong Kong. My father's family were all in the United States or in Australia, except for Uncle Richard, who returned to China after having spent his early career in the US in the 1950s. The R's that were involved were responsibilities, roles, resources, and relationships, and also some rights, because of course mother was not a citizen. We had no citizenship within this country. And the depression that she had manifested itself in silence. And so I grew up not really knowing anything about my mother's family, or really not caring much about her or her family, whereas my father was very voluble. He knew where everyone was, and had, a reasonably satisfying professional job. So I, through therapy, over the years, I was able to make my peace with her. And when she died in 1987, I was able to speak about her and about her, my viewing her as a heroine, and and also the fact that she had lived in silence for all of my childhood and adolescence, until she learned that in 1987 that her family, her siblings, were still alive. So, back to childhood. I was a minor outcast. I was a funny-looking kid who wore glasses. And perhaps I was a minor outcast because I was teacher's pet in first and third grades. The other thought that occurred to me just a couple of days ago was that I was teacher's pet as a form of protection because I was an immigrant, because I'm sure my parents spoke to my teachers and said, we're worried about Claire. She manifested these behaviors when we were living in Bloomington. Please look out for her. So maybe I was teacher's pet because there was some bullying that I don't remember, and so they took preemptive action and made me their pet. It's hard to know. I have had a lot of later positive experiences in my life that have been protective for me. In an earlier session with Chelsea, I spoke to an experience of depersonalization, or sort of feeling that I was sitting, a member of our Hearing Voices group that I was in, that I was facilitating, spoke to sometimes getting that sinking feeling in the pit of their stomach, and then sort of feeling that they could see their bodies sitting where they were sitting, and then, but their perceptions being, their minds being able to watch their bodies. And I that as a result of his conversation, I was able to remember that often throughout my childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, I had had those feelings. I don't anymore. I think that experiencing psychosis and being able to overcome those experiences essentially brought me back to the person I was destined to be had I not had those various traumatic experiences. So positives, moved to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It was the best thing that could have happened to me because I made many friends and developed a strong sense of belonging within my community. And I'll speak more to this tomorrow in the plenary panel. And my sister started dating her husband. My parents disapproved. There were terrible fights, and I began withdrawing from all of my friends because I was afraid to speak about our sad little family secret. And I didn't. And also I don't know how much of the fact, my middle sister was my best friend and chief tormentor growing up. And I think that she probably lost her. I lost my best friend to my new brother-in-law. My father retired at the end of my junior year in high school, and I went to college, skipping my senior year. I thought it was largely negative. During my freshman year, I stopped being able to read quite as efficiently as I had throughout my life, and I don't know whether that was the onset of whatever mental health issues I was struggling with. And I sometimes had a hard time thinking and understanding questions in classes and during exams. And I graduated from college, moved to Boston, had conflict with one of my two roommates. And it was not a question of triangulation, but this is one of my experiences is that I I'm very sensitive to energies, and when I moved to Boston in the fall of 1972, I was really exuberant. I was thrilled to be living in the Northeast, where both my sisters had gone to Pembroke, which was then part of Brown. But I had skipped my senior year in high school and didn't get to go to the best college I could get into. And it all sounds like so much whining, but family expectation can be a powerful factor. And so I didn't have the same opportunities, the same the familial resources were not there for me to have the same advantages that my two sisters had. And yet I had to be part of the family. And so I continued to be the least of my sisters. And my father told me that when I was in college that I had the most mature intellect of my sisters. So that is another factor in that can lead to psychosis. The not living up to own expectations or expectations of others. And I wondered, the conflict with my roommate, whether the conflict with my roommate had whether I felt her anger and animosity, and because the reason we had a fight is that we decided to share, to prepare all our meals together and to share the grocery bill. And whenever my former roommate, Kathy, and I prepared meals, we prepared a big meal and we all ate heartily. Whenever this other roommate prepared meals, because she was trying to maintain a car as well as work as a research assistant at Harvard, she would make a single hot dog. We each had one hot dog and split a can of beans. And Kathy and I were always hungry, and we were rolling our eyes at each other. And finally I said, okay, I'm going to buy my own groceries and prepare my own meals. Well, that was the end of it. And the other thing is that this young woman had been a graduate student in chemistry at Furman and had my father as a teacher, and she apparently was not that good a student. And my father gave her a C, and my father told me that after I told her that she would be one of our roommates. So there was that already pre-existing hostility toward me. And so did I feel her negative energy? Probably, because I went from being really happy to not being able to do anything. I dropped out of a class in American Cultural History at Harvard Extension. I stopped doing anything. I just stayed at home, and I was afraid to do things. And then in December just before Christmas of 1973, I met Gil, my first serious boyfriend, who was 9 years older. He was very sophisticated, very kind, wonderful ACLU environmental and civil rights lawyer. And he, really deepened within me my budding social justice orientation. And I do want to say, in my family's defense, we were an immigrant family, and so we didn't really recognize, the need to do social justice work, the importance of being fully a part of the community and working with those who are less fortunate. Then I got married. I chose not to marry Gil because he was the difference in our ages. And because I was too young, I think, to be in that relationship. I ended up marrying Bill, a young man whom I'd met in Boston during those years, and I loved him very much. But there was, I think. I don't know what it was, but the precipitating event for my first extended psychotic break from consensual reality was the suicide of my first cousin, whom I met in China. When I was pretty volatile. I would last about 6 months in jobs and either quit or walk out. I would get bored and unleave or unhappy and leave. You know, I had, for the first 10 years of my working career, working life, I was underemployed, unhappily employed, and just completely confused about who I was and what I wanted. And I was really at, and probably I was experiencing all the things that I still experience now, but not understanding it and attributing it to other people and feeling, blaming others, blaming myself. So I got to go to China because my mother had recently reconnected with family. One of her first cousins, with whom she'd grown up, her parents had died when she was a girl, and so my maternal grandfather adopted her, and she saw my Uncle Richard, who was father's older brother, on a boat, got mother's address, began corresponding, and I realized I forgot to put the death of my father as a significant event, which is, but yes,
How old was your mother when she was forced to leave the job she loved in Hong Kong?
She was 45. She had founded the Mencius Library, which was the first library in Hong Kong with an all-Chinese collection. And my apologies for being so scattered. It has, you know, I do much better when I'm reading, which I'm going to do tomorrow. And so there were other factors in my life that, you know, led me to where I am. The precipitating factor was the suicide of my first cousin Jean, whom I had met in China. Her parents, she was the least fortunate of the children in that family, had been sent to the countryside at age 14, and her formal education stopped. Her parents asked my mother to sponsor her as a student in the United States, and I competed with my sister Daphne to bring her to the States as a to complete the foreign student application to bring her to the United States, and she committed suicide within a year by swallowing 2 bottles of pills she'd brought with her from China. And we learned that she'd attempted suicide twice in China. I felt incredible guilt and shame for the role I'd played in bringing her to the States and putting her in jeopardy. And I began questioning everything about myself. And at that point, I almost committed suicide myself. I thought I would trade my life for hers so that the score between the 2 families would be even. And at that point, I began hearing voices. I now wonder whether it was, you know, throughout the decade when I was extremely volatile and depressed and flirted with the idea of suicide, but never come close to even making a plan. But when I really made a plan and I was going to throw myself in front of a train, then it was as if I had strained or broken some aspect of the life contract or the contract with that which we know or believe to be God, or life itself. And I, you know, began hearing voices and, yes.
After you attempted suicide, when you first started hearing voices, or were you already hearing voices?
I was not hearing voices external to myself. I did do automatic writing. I did talk to a presence, but it was sort of like thoughts, like intrusive thoughts, or just thoughts that occur to you. unless I was entering reveries that I don't remember. But I do remember that I broke my study board across the banister of my bed in my dorm room one night when I was alone in our suite. And, you won't talk to me. And then as soon as I shouted those words in the room, unfortunately no one was there, I thought, oh my God. And I looked at my broken board and, found a giant garbage bag and took it down to the basement. But that's the only time I recall ever having spoken aloud to a voice, or really even having spoken to a voice. I wrote a lot of poetry, and I wrote a couple of beautiful poems that don't seem at all like me, when I was in my 20s. So I imagine I was channeling someone. I think I've probably done that throughout my life. I've often felt that I have no personality of my own if I'm in the presence of someone with a stronger personality. I've often found myself doing things that are not things I would customarily do, or saying things that I would not customarily say. I often find myself when I meet someone, particularly if I'm feeling very open and embracing, when I begin speaking to them, every other word out of my mouth is wrong. Sometimes I can barely say my name properly, but I've learned that if I throw up my guard, then I can regain my equanimity within a few seconds. And then, within 10 or 15 seconds, I'm able to speak pretty much as I am now. And certainly when we're under stress, we do stumble and falter and stumble more. But these experiences of having the thoughts be taken out of my head, of it being in choir practice and having someone sit down beside me. And perhaps I'm benefiting from the voices of the other people in the choir, the energies. And so when someone comes and sits down for me, it's not that she's robbing me of my energy, it's just that she's broken the energy flow. But these are very real phenomena that I experience. And I imagine that other people who have extreme experiences experience the same things. And it's so puzzling until we realize it's, we get on the same wavelength with people. We can be brilliant with some people and just idiotic with other people and incredibly silly with some people. And some people make us laugh uproariously. And some people are just, but it is, and once we learn that, that people are different and that our experiences are not permanent, and that if we simply press on and don't dwell on the fear that it is permanent, that it somehow means something pathological and destructive, then we can continue to be our best selves. So, I'm going to stop here. And pass out the handout, and really, I've given you some of the high points, and the point of all this, and as I said, it's a work in progress. My hope had been actually to look at some real questionnaires and that sort of thing. I'm not a researcher, I'm a voice here who's doing the best I can, and I hope you will forgive me for, but the goal of this is to get those of us who, with lived experience, and the clinicians who work with us, to begin really delving into the stories of our lives. And as we continue working, answering these questions, answering additional questions, talking about what comes to mind, we can really get to what happened and some of the nuances, the details that can add so much richness to our understanding, can increase insight, and really, and help us to live, to figure out what happened, why it happened, why we feel the way we do, and whether it's productive or constructive to stay in that place. And if it's not, to begin working, to begin thinking about ways to address the things that we continue to do, the things that we think and feel that keep us stuck where we are. And, basically to use these backstories to help us press forward. So I'm going to hand this stuff out. I have big ones as well. And I wish this were a polished, I have to finish the presentation quickly. I just want to, and I will send you the PowerPoint. So I hope to make a beautiful journey map like this. And if those of you who were at the ISPS International Conference may have seen this as one of the posters. I think it won second prize as a poster presentation. And I met this woman because she was staying at the hotel where I was. And that's what the whole thing looks like. That's as far as I got. So there's this lovely Venn diagram about how we heal. And self-healing comes from positive self-talk, as well as hearing voices, support groups, and just basically the positive voices in our lives that allow us to hold our heads up and to counter the negative voices in our heads and seemingly in our environments. Sit with it. Oh, sit with wit. That's interesting. I got that off the internet, so I don't know. I Googled. I'm not sure where I found it, but try both.
We'll track it down.
Okay, thanks. Meditation, sleep is hugely important. Movement, dance. Nutrition, journaling is hugely important. One of the members of the community support group I facilitate used to have horrific nightmares, and they would, make her want to start cutting again. And she started journaling, basically before she went to sleep, she would start journaling, the events of the day, and her nightmares have gone away. Learning about ourselves, and it is, journaling is a process of learning about ourselves. Giving and receiving love, asking for help, support groups, etc. Citizenship and resilience. You're going to hear this again tomorrow, so I'm not going to read that. But this is me as part of my folk singing group, me at my book signing with a friend and this is my family in Alaska. That's my son with shoulder-length hair when he was in college. That's me at a work event. My son is a baby. And factors that contributed to my resilience, loving, stable family, history of self-paid employment. You'll hear that again tomorrow. Thank you. This is my son receiving a master's in statistics from the University of Chicago. And that's him in Chicago, wearing a t-shirt he's had since the 8th grade. Neighborhood music school, and it was his home away from home, and I think is, if he had a predisposition toward extreme experiences, I think his music training, he went to Oberlin College and Conservatory. He was in the 5-year double degree program, graduating with degrees in flute performance and psychology. So, questions?